So with me is Swathi Srinivasan. Swathi is a 2017 graduate of Beechwood High School in Beechwood. She will be a graduate of Harvard University in 2021. And most importantly, she was announced as one of 32 Rhodes Scholars about a week ago. She is a 2016 Melvin Scholar after having presented at our annual meeting. She is a 2016 State Science Day alumna, and she is an AJAS fellow and received that fellowship at the AJAS conference in 2017. Swathi, congratulations on behalf of our Board of Trustees and our members. We're very proud of you. And again, congratulations on receiving the Rhodes Scholarship.
Thank you so much.
So what does it mean to be a Rhodes Scholar?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I've thought a lot about over these last few days and weeks. I think foremost, it's a big responsibility. So as you know, the Rhodes Scholarship takes you to Oxford for 2 or 3 years, and most, if not all, of the selected recipients have some sort of public service goal, some sort of outward-facing impact that they want to have on the world, whether that's to cure a disease or to address some sort of underlying inequality or both, or address climate change. It's a lot of students that want to do some real good. So foremost, I think the breadth and I think the name of the Rhodes Scholarship gives you such a huge platform for people to hear your message that foremost, it's a huge responsibility. It's also a big privilege. I'm very aware of what it means to other people and what I can do with it, which again brings me back to the responsibility point, that there's just a lot that can be done with this and a lot that I hope to do with it. Personally, it means that I'll be able to work on health inequality. So why is it that some people get access to care but not others? Why is it that some people are disproportionately affected by the opioid epidemic but not others? Why HIV for some people but not others? And hoping to understand what those inequalities are and then hoping to go a step further and actually fixing them.
That's great. So what are you currently majoring in, and what are your interests or your the research at Harvard that you're doing? And I realize Oxford may have a plan for you, but what are your plans at Oxford as well?
Yeah, sure. So I had a really interesting college experience where I came in pretty strongly pre-med. I was going to study neuroscience, very in line with the research that I'd done at State Science Day on Alzheimer's disease. And then I got here and I started wondering, if we were to solve Alzheimer's disease, would everyone get the cure? And I realized more and more that the answer to that was no. And I was more concerned with answering why that was no, as opposed to answering the laboratory question. So I moved pretty quickly into the field of public health, started studying HIV and the opioid epidemic, and now COVID-19, which led me to study in school something called social studies, which is actually a combination of government, economics, philosophy, sociology, and history. And those topics together help us understand why are we where we are today. And that question is really important for understanding how do we move forward. So on one hand, I studied social studies, and then I did it in a double major with something called the history of science. And I focused on the history of public health crises. So why is HIV the way that it is in the United States versus in Brazil versus in Portugal? And became really interested in how the world approaches global problems. So, Portugal's approach to the opioid epidemic is very different from the United States. The United States' approach to HIV was very different from Brazil. And I started doing research in different international contexts on how do we problem solve, how are governments problem solving, how are local NGOs, nonprofits problem solving. And I became interested in the underlying inequalities that lead to health outcomes, but also the ways in which those are ameliorated by people across the world. Because I think, Ohio in the United States has something to learn from maybe Portugal or England or Brazil. So that's one side of my research. And right now I'm writing a thesis on COVID-19 in Brazil and, the failures and successes of the health system, of the government, if at all. I mean, they're in a really interesting political moment, just like we are. And then on the other side of things, I was actually, I'd left, the hard sciences for a little bit, where after doing some research my freshman year here, I took a little bit of a break, focused more on the opioid epidemic, HIV/AIDS. But then I had my own medical crisis where I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma over my junior year. I went through chemotherapy all of last semester and last year, radiation. And I became really interested in how we think of the patient as a person. So after being on the other side of studying disease and studying science, I was now the person in the chair, the person in the hospital. And I realized just how vastly different science is and how it's applied when you're a patient. And, at the time I was thinking about how side effects when we think of disease are often like a secondary problem to like actually solving that disease. Like, oh, we'll give you this chemotherapy, but like, there's a side effect of nausea or your hair might fall out. And I started thinking like those side effects are also really big issues too. And like to different people, they matter differently. Maybe for me, I could take a day off of school if I was feeling really nauseous, but a single parent can't. They're still caring for their kid. They still have to go to work. They still have to get to the hospital. When COVID-19 hit, I biked to the hospital every day. How did other people get to the hospital if they don't have a car, if they don't have a bike, if they live farther away from the hospital than I do? So I started thinking again back to this question of inequality and back to the question of access. And it made me feel much more connected to this question that I was hoping to answer all throughout college as well. But it also brought me back to the lab where I'm now working on a chemotherapy drug that is less nauseous than the current chemotherapy regimen for lymphoma. So two different worlds, but really connected over this question of access and ease and patient comfort.
So I can see how your background is, one, it's filled with curiosity, and you're always asking questions, and you're looking for, answers and solutions and coming up with that. So when we, the benefit in the academy, and I'm always supporting this, is that learning through inquiry allows students to apply what they're being taught, right? It's the aha moment, and why do we need to learn this stuff anyhow? And it makes coursework more relevant. So I was hoping maybe you could tell us about your experiences at District Science Day, State Science Day, and please feel free to offer advice to our middle school and high school students.
Yeah, I think it might actually, all of the curiosity and inquiry-driven, I guess, science that I've done is probably stemmed from one aspect of my personality that's really stubborn. Like I refuse to believe that there are questions we can't answer. And as a kid, I think you're often belittled. Like people look at you and they're like, "Oh, you're just a kid." But I'm like, a kid is as powerful, if not more creative and more powerful and poised to answer some of these questions than adults are. So I was like, if I had a problem, like who said I couldn't fix it, right? No matter the resources, obviously those matter too, and we'll get into that later, but your mind is the most powerful thing that I think we have. And like if you put your foot forward to read that book or to Google that term, we can answer the questions that we have. They can be very small questions, but small questions are often very big questions too. And I think for me, it was a really true understanding that if I wanted to and I cared about it, I could answer a question. And this became, a way that I lived my life from when I was a little kid. And, my feet would hurt when I was walking. I was like, why do my feet hurt? Why is it that I can't run the full lap and everyone else can? But I know I might physically want to, but my feet hurt too much. And then I realized, oh, I was flat-footed, or like, oh, my shoes were wrong. And then how do I fix that? But then all the solutions were too expensive. So then I was like, how can I create it myself? And I think both being fostered by two parents that loved me unconditionally and were really supportive of my work, to like having, the internet where I could look at how other people have solved these problems and what I could do better than them so that it solved my problem. It became how I lived my life. And I think from a problem as small as, flat-footedness, which again, I would argue was a very big problem for sixth grade me, to something like Alzheimer's disease, where I'm like, why is it that in India, the rates of Alzheimer's are lower than that in the United States? What could be the difference there? What is my family in India doing differently than maybe my neighbor in the United States? And then that became what was my district science fair and my state science fair project in high school, when I started to find places that had the resources to be able to actually solve this question. Because this wasn't one that I could build in my room, though there's far more that you can probably do there than I think people give me credit for. And I emailed a bunch of labs in a university near me. I was in 10th grade. In hindsight, I don't know why they accepted me, but then I realized, sending an email never hurts. And I'm glad that I did. And my first piece of advice would be to never hesitate to ask a question, whether that's a scientific question or a question for someone for mentorship or for resources. Never hesitate to, because chances are they were once in your situation or they were once in your boat. And I remember the Zagorski lab took a chance on little me, who had never stepped foot in the lab before, other than maybe high school chemistry, which was also a completely different environment. And I got my foot in the lab and I started working and I loved it. And because I loved it, I put in the extra mile. I came in on weekends. And I think being driven by the question that I cared about a problem that I cared about, got me there at times when people might not have wanted to. And I think that's another piece of advice that I have, which is, as opposed to deciding to pick a question and then finding the topic you care about, go the other way around. Think about what you care about and then find what questions you have about that topic. Because at the end of the day, that's what's going to get you to State Science Fair. That's what's going to get you asking big questions and trying to answer them late at night when no one else wants to do extra work, but because you truly care. And being driven by that care, by that empathy, I think by true knowledge that like whatever question there was, like I could at least be a part of answering it, that got me to where I am now.
I was going to say, so a couple of things that jumped out to me during that was you can answer a lot of questions and do investigations that don't have to take place in a sophisticated research laboratory. And sometimes those are the very best projects and the ones that we appreciate the most. And the other thing is, I'm asked quite often from students and parents, how do I find a mentor? Can you help? And it's a matter of trial and error and asking and emailing and putting yourself out there, if I'm hearing you correctly. So we also had a celebration of science this summer, and it was a junior from Solon High School, Michelle Park, that got access to the Sleuth Observatory in the Canary Islands. And the question was at the end of her presentation on our Zoom call, how in the world did you get access to the Sleuth Observatory? And it was somebody that she met at a conference. I believe it was a Science Olympiad that took place in Denver, and she met a professor at Stanford. And through persistence, hard work, and continually, putting herself out there, she was able to get access. So that is, it's hard work and it's networking, and networking is often it's work, so.
I think people because you're worried about that other person, like, what if they say no, or, what if like they don't like my idea, or what if, I can't work with them, and am I going to make them feel bad? Or what if I reach out to 10 people and 2 say yes, and then I have to pick one? At the end of the day, like people are more than happy to help. I think we forget that, but like individuals that are in positions of power now, that are researchers now, were also once little kids. They were also once 5th graders and 10th graders and 12th graders asking their questions in their bedroom, And at the end of the day, like I would love to be a mentor. I know so many of my mentors were so excited, to work with me because they saw something in me that was like them. And I hope to do that with young STEM students who are also asking big questions, because at the end of the day, like we know that we got here with a lot of help. And I, for one, am really eager to pay it forward because, I wouldn't be here without it. And I think a lot of other mentors I've worked with are very similar. And there's just no harm in sending an email. None at all. If they say no, you don't even have to see them in person for them to say no. And I also would totally agree with that story that I remember being, I'm just like Googling online, looking for funding for a project I was doing. And, you're totally right that some of the best projects are done without the lab. Like I loved my Alzheimer's project. I think my favorite project that I've ever did, if not it was called Fix a Flat Foot Fast, was a project that I did where I, had burnt my hand on a resistor in physics lab and was like, wow, this is actually a really cool heating mechanism. So I like created a grid of resistors and like, made a heating pad, which is a huge problem in low and middle income countries, that like children die of hypothermia almost at birth because of their birth weight. And my dad was the person that built incubators, which were super expensive, super big, but did this job really well. And I was like, well, what about everybody else? And this project, I built it in my basement. I had looked online, and MIT had this like high school science funding thing where it was called MIT Think. So I sent the project application to them. Like I said, I don't really have a mentor. I'm not really working in a lab, but like I could really use the money. And they were like, sure. So they brought me to MIT, and then I met, all these crazy scientists who were doing amazing work. I remember, just seeing the person that came up with a project that I had cited in my bibliography when I was first coming up with this project plan, which is just a surreal moment when you get to meet someone whose work like you based your work off of in some way. And, that all started with an email, and then it started with an application. And then, lo and behold, I made it to Boston for the first time and got to see MIT, got to see Harvard, these behemoths of academics and education, something I had never, ever considered. Like, I was going to Case Western my whole life. And that was where I thought I was going to go. That was where I thought I was going to, spend my undergrad. And then I ended up here, partially and largely, actually, because of the first moment that I had where I was exposed, which was an idea that I had in physics class after being burnt, And that
Mm-hmm.
project led to the International Science Fair, and I actually remember placing, and USAID had given me funding because they said, the United States could use this. And it's like, how did that happen, right? It happened from just an idea in my basement, talking to my dad and talking to my physics teacher, and I found mentors in both of them. So at the end of the day, mentorship, it's huge. It's why where I am. It's whether that's close to home and it's my parents, or those are teachers in middle school, high school, whether those are professors and these big scholarships, you can find inspiration and mentorship anywhere.
I was going to say, now students in Ohio don't have to seek out that opportunity with MIT, although that was a wonderful thing to have access to. But they can do it now through a program of the Academy's Believe in Ohio, where we give them the opportunity to ideate and how to commercialize that project or that idea to solve that problem. So, we're trying to do those things to connect all of our programs. Swathi, I thank you for remembering us and for coming back and doing this interview and connecting with our students and offering that advice. That's wonderful. And also, I want to thank you for being such an easy interview.
No, not a problem. I mean, I think about a lot of these questions, how did I get here personally? And I have a lot of, the mentors, the Academy, people to thank for that, people who invested in my work, who invested in me, who made me feel like my work mattered. And I think that's the biggest thing that I think the Ohio Academy of Science did so well is keeping me inspired, making me feel as though what I was doing was important, that people were listening to me, young little me, as I ranted about all the problems in the world that I wanted to solve. And I think, at the end of the day, people are listening, right? We want the next generation of ideas and thoughts, and who is better to start cultivating that than our fifth graders and our sixth graders and our 10th graders and our 11th graders who are thinking these big things in such a creative way. And at the end of the day, for me, I'm excited, to pay it forward. I'm excited to hopefully, invest in and mentor a young student or students as they embark on this process, because it's a fun one, it's a necessary one, and the world's going to be better off because of it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, of course. It was so much fun to catch up. I'm really glad to hear about the Believe in Ohio program. It's so exciting, and that's exactly what we need.